The Shadows of Unit 731, America's Secret Connection to Japan's Hidden War Crimes. Hook. The experiments you've never been taught in history class almost changed the course of the modern world because the United States looked the other way. Part 1. The Forbidden Lab in the Mountains. In the sweltering heat of Harbin, Manchuria during the 1930s, a hidden complex carved into the hillsides housed one of history's most horrifying human experiments. Officially, it was labeled a research facility, but what happened inside defied comprehension. Unit 731, the secret biological and chemical warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, was designed to study humans as nothing more than living test subjects. Men, women, and children were captured from nearby villages and Chinese cities under false pretenses. They were forced into experiments that tested frostbite, lethal pathogens, germ warfare, and extreme vivisection, all without anesthesia. The experiments weren't just sadistic, they were systematic, scientific, and meticulously documented. Every file, every photo, every observation was filed into a vast archive meant for Japanese military planners. But what history rarely emphasizes is what happened after the war. The United States discovered Unit 731's archives, comprehensive records of atrocities. And instead of pursuing justice with the rigor applied to Nuremberg, U.S. intelligence officers made a shocking decision. They granted immunity to the perpetrators in exchange for their research. This decision would ripple through decades, shaping American military and biological research. Some of the methods tested in Harbin were quietly integrated into U.S. labs. Some of the scientists were quietly absorbed into American programs. The ethical cost? Entire generations of victims were denied justice, and the public remained unaware. 1. Origins of the Shadow Army. Unit 731 began in 1932 in Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state. Led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a physician obsessed with biological warfare, it was a fusion of ambition, ideology, and sheer cruelty. Ishii had a singular vision: to develop the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, a weapon that did not rely on bombs, artillery, or conventional armies. Instead, it relied on germs, plague, cholera, anthrax, and smallpox. Experiments were organized methodically. Prisoners, often political dissidents, POWs, or captured civilians, were divided into units for experimentation. Frostbite testing. Limbs frozen and thawed repeatedly, sometimes amputated. Lethal pathogens. Prisoners deliberately exposed to plague or cholera. Vivisection. Organs removed from living humans to study disease progression. Chemical weapons. Mustard gas and other toxins tested on unknowing subjects. The camp had its own hospitals, laboratories, and execution chambers. Guards called the victims logs, dehumanized, anonymous, expendable. 2. The United States finds out. As WWII drew to a close, the Allies discovered the horrors of Nazi concentration camps. But while Nuremberg trials pursued justice, the U.S. was quietly conducting its own investigations into the Far East. American intelligence officers from the Office of Strategic Services and later the CIA obtained captured documents, film reels, and survivor testimony from Japanese archives. These files contained exhaustive detail: dates, times, temperatures, bacterial cultures, and the fates of individual victims. The U.S. recognized something horrifying: the data had potential military value. At the time, the Cold War loomed. Knowledge of biological weapons could tip the scales in future conflicts. And so, a moral compromise was made. Ishii and his senior staff were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution. Research records were handed over to American laboratories. The identities of the victims were suppressed. This decision was hidden in top-secret agreements, buried deep in Pentagon and CIA archives. Only decades later did historians piece together the story. 3. The experiments that shocked the Americans. When U.S. officials reviewed the Unit 731 documents, the data was both horrifying and scientifically detailed. Experiments included plague bombs, deliberate infection of Chinese cities via fleas, vivisection without anesthesia, internal organs studied in real time while subjects were alive, forced pregnancies and germ exposure to study congenital effects of diseases, frostbite experiments, extremities frozen to gangrene, amputated, and tissue studied. The Americans were not morally neutral, but opportunistic. Some documents were used in U.S. germ warfare programs at Fort Detrick. The experiments gave insights into disease transmission, antibiotic limits, and pathogen lethality. Part 2. The Trial That Never Happened. The world was poised for justice. In Europe, the Nuremberg trials were underway. Nazi doctors, generals, and industrialists were being held accountable for crimes that shocked humanity. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were many, and the moral mandate was obvious. Yet across the Pacific, an entire network of war criminals, responsible for atrocities that rivaled and in some cases surpassed those of the Nazis, quietly escaped the public eye. Shiro Ishii, the head of Unit 731, would never face a tribunal. He walked away from the war not as a criminal, but as a man quietly absorbed into U.S.-led research programs. 1. The OSS investigation. In late 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency and precursor to the CIA, began interrogating captured Japanese officers. They were primarily focused on the threat of chemical and biological weapons in the hands of the Japanese Army. When interrogators began asking about Unit 731, Ishii's subordinates were initially evasive. But the OSS officers were meticulous, leveraging captured documents, Japanese medical records, and photographs. The records were horrifyingly detailed. Temperature logs for frostbite experiments, disease progression charts, lists of executed prisoners, and lab notes describing vivisections of men, women, and children. The officers quickly realized the information was invaluable. Biological warfare was the new frontier. If the Soviets or China gained access to this knowledge first, the balance of power in Asia and eventually the world could be decisively altered. 2. The decision to grant immunity. By early 1946, American policymakers faced a choice. 1. Prosecute the Unit 731 leadership in a war crimes tribunal, as was being done with Nazi doctors. 2. Trade immunity for research data, giving the U.S. exclusive access to one of the most extensive biological weapons databases in history. The decision was pragmatic and morally catastrophic. The National Security Council and the Army's Chemical Warfare Service concluded that the strategic value of Ishii's research outweighed the public demand for justice. On January 12, 1946, a secret memorandum was drafted. Its directives were clear. Ishii and his key staff would not be prosecuted. Unit 731 documents, including photographs and research notes, would be secured by the U.S. Army and the OSS. All evidence of human experimentation would be classified, effectively erasing the victims from history. The memo was marked top secret, eyes only, and for decades it remained buried in a vault, forgotten by all but a handful of military officials. 3. The scientists who escaped justice. Shiro Ishii was not alone. Over 30 Unit 731 researchers were absorbed into various American and Allied programs. Some were relocated to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the U.S. Biological Warfare Research Center; Pacific Military Research Labs, studying plague, anthrax, and other pathogens; secret CIA and Pentagon programs, applying findings to biowarfare and covert operations. Many of these scientists lived openly in Japan, quietly consulting with U.S. agencies while the world assumed they had been tried or forgotten. One of the most chilling revelations: American scientists were aware of the human cost, yet actively chose to prioritize research utility over justice. According to declassified files, U.S. intelligence officers argued that the use of live human subjects, while abhorrent, provides data otherwise impossible to acquire. These experiments cannot go to waste. This reasoning was later echoed in internal memos, exposing a calculated ethical compromise on an unprecedented scale. 4. The suppression of evidence. Unlike Nuremberg, where photographs, films, and eyewitness testimony were made public, Unit 731's archives remained classified. Thousands of photographs showing visection and lethal infections were kept in U.S. military vaults. Detailed logs of plague experiments on live prisoners were never released. Survivor testimony was buried in confidential OSS reports. Even Japanese journalists and historians attempting to investigate the events in post-war Japan faced intimidation and censorship, much of it influenced indirectly by U.S. occupation forces who wished to control the narrative. 5. Early U.S. biological warfare programs. By 1947, some of the Unit 731 personnel were working under American oversight in laboratories studying anthrax aerosolization, plague infection vectors, pathogen resilience in various climates, human tolerance thresholds to infectious diseases. The moral ambiguity is staggering. The U.S. had become a custodian of the most horrifying human experiments ever conducted, experiments whose data had been derived entirely from non-consenting victims. 6. Public awareness and the cover-up. For decades, the American public, and even most of the military, remained unaware of the scale of Unit 731. It was a dark secret known only to a small circle within the Pentagon, the CIA, senior Army officials, a few scientific collaborators. Books, documentaries, and academic papers about World War II rarely mention Unit 731, let alone the American decision to absorb its research. When journalists began reporting the story in the 1980s and 1990s, the reaction was muted. Declassified documents were incomplete. Officials refused to comment. Survivors' testimonies were scattered and hard to verify. Yet the reality remained. The United States benefited directly from crimes that would have been considered war crimes anywhere else. Part 3. Experiments that shaped a secret war. The horrors of Unit 731 were not merely acts of cruelty. They were highly structured, pseudo-scientific studies designed to produce data that would revolutionize warfare. For the American officers reviewing the captured archives in 1945-1946, the implications were staggering. Every graph, chart, and photograph detailed precise measurements, infection rates, incubation periods, lethality, and physiological responses to extreme conditions. The data, while morally repugnant, promised a level of understanding of biological weapons that the U.S. had never before possessed. 1. Plague and pathogen experiments. At the heart of Unit 731's research was the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which had decimated Europe in centuries past. Prisoners were exposed to plague through infected fleas sewn into their bodies, aerosol sprays in enclosed chambers, deliberate contamination of food and water. In one record, a group of 20 prisoners was infected with pneumonic plague. The notes meticulously recorded the timeline of fever, cough, and eventual death, as well as the progression of organ failure. Some prisoners were dissected immediately after death. Others remained alive to observe the internal spread of the disease. When U.S. intelligence analysts reviewed these files, they realized the precision of infection timing could inform biological warfare strategies. Which pathogens were most lethal, how quickly they spread, and how to weaponize them. All of this was now in American hands. 2. Frostbite and environmental tolerance testing. Unit 731 conducted extreme environmental experiments to understand how human bodies responded to cold. Prisoners were forced to endure freezing temperatures while limbs were deliberately exposed, frozen, and thawed. The goal was to determine the threshold at which frostbite became irreversible, the effectiveness of various warming techniques, survival rates under extreme cold. American officers reading these records recognized their value for potential cold weather warfare scenarios, particularly in Europe and Siberia, where the U.S. might face the Soviet Union. The idea that data from tortured human beings could be repurposed for military strategy was chilling, but it was exactly what happened. 3. Vivisection without anesthesia. Perhaps the most infamous experiments involved live dissections. Prisoners were subjected to surgeries where organs were removed while subjects remained conscious. Heart, liver, and lungs were studied for disease progression. Experiments included artificially induced infections to study their effects. The Americans received detailed photographic evidence noting the progression of disease in vivo. Some of this data would later inform U.S. biomedical research, particularly in understanding disease pathology, albeit without the ethical constraints that modern science would demand. 4. Integration into American programs. Once the Unit 731 files were in U.S. hands, they were carefully analyzed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, America's biological warfare hub. CIA covert research projects, exploring weaponized pathogens. Pentagon special programs, studying airborne dispersal and human resistance. Reports revealed that U.S. scientists explicitly cited Unit 731 experiments in planning studies on biological agents. While public records later emphasized ethical experimentation, internal memos show the direct lineage from Japanese experiments to U.S. programs. 5. Moral and scientific consequences. The adoption of Unit 731 research presented ethical dilemmas that haunted decades of American policy. Scientists knew the data came from tortured and murdered humans, yet they used it. War crimes that were prosecuted in Europe were ignored in the Pacific. Victims' identities remained classified, erased from history. Some historians argue that without this data, the U.S. biological weapons program would have taken decades longer to develop. Others condemn the decision as a stain on American moral authority, suggesting that the pursuit of knowledge was valued over justice. 6. Survivors and forgotten voices. Few survivors of Unit 731 were ever able to speak publicly. Those who did recount families torn apart, experiments that defied human comprehension, the erasure of their suffering from global consciousness. Yet their voices were drowned out by decades of secrecy, censorship, and the geopolitical needs of the early Cold War. 7. Global implications. The American acquisition of Unit 731's research set the stage for Cold War biological warfare planning, U.S.-Japan scientific collaborations, secret, limited to select military and research circles. A hidden ethical precedent, the idea that data from atrocities could be morally justified if it served national interests. The consequences are still felt today in debates over human experimentation, bioethics, and military responsibility.
Subscribe for more ancient mysteries finally being uncovered. New archaeology videos every week. Don't miss the next discovery. Join thousands of American viewers exploring the hidden side of history.